Hi there everyone, hope you're all safe. So today's video we're making tofu fish and I freaking love it. Not a big fish hand, never have been a big fish hand. I can't stand bones in it. I hate it when the fish gets too strong a flavour, it just lowers my stomach. None of these problems with tofu fish, but it still hits that exact same zone when you eat it. One of the wee secrets to this one is the double batter. If you don't double batter, it's not as nice. The few times that I have enjoyed fish and chips, it's always been a chippy that's done the double battering, and that's sort of stuck with me as one of the features that I like about fish. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Let's make this. So, first things first, drain the water out of your tofu packet, little slice, and then drain it down the sink. And once the water has been drained, take it out of the packet in preparation for compressing the rest of the water out of it. The setup I prefer to use for squeezing the water out of my tofu is grab yourself a plastic cutting board, then 2 sheets of kitchen roll, fold it in half and then half again, then sit your tofu on top of the kitchen roll. Repeat with more kitchen roll on top of the tofu and then another plastic kitchen board that you can use to balance whatever it is you're going to compress the tofu with. From here I like to use the mortar from my mortar and pestle set because it's made of granite, it's an excellent compact weight so it's good for compressing it down, but use whatever you have at hand. And from here we want to compress our tofu for 5 minutes, but during that time we need to check that the compression's even so that we're not squeezing one side more than another and getting off-shaped tofu. When compressing 2 blocks you don't need to worry about it as much as with 1 block, it's more likely to deform shape-wise with 1. But once the 5 minutes is over, we want to take and we want to refresh our setup, so we're going to remove all the water that's sitting on our chopping block, squeeze out the kitchen roll and reset with fresh kitchen roll top and bottom. We're then going to compress it for 25 minutes with the weight on top again. If this was just 1 block that we were compressing, after the first 25 minutes is over it would almost certainly be ready. But with 2 blocks you tend to have to put it through a third 25 minute cycle or a third cycle lasting 25 minutes again. So as to add to the weight and give us greater compression, I've gone and added a jam jar into the centre of my mortar as well. That little bit extra weight will just help squeeze the water out better. Now as your 25 minutes progresses, just pay close attention as to whether everything's sitting level or not. With 2 blocks it's quite easy to keep it level. With 1 block it can deform and deform very quickly, so you need to be more careful if you're compressing 1 block over 2 blocks. Now, as mentioned, after 25 minutes, there can still be a lot of water within your tofu if it's 2 blocks you're crushing. 1 block, it's almost certainly going to be fine if you've got the right weight, but with 2 blocks, there can still be a lot of water in it. The way to check is if your tofu feels wet to the touch, even though we've squeezed a lot of water out of it here, if it still feels damp, feels moist to the touch, it needs another cycle, so give it another 25-minute compression. And as we can see from the end of our second 25-minute compression cycle, there was still an awful lot of water come out of the tofu. We can see it on the board, we can see it on the kitchen roll when I squeeze the kitchen roll out, but most importantly the tofu to the touch now feels dry. It's not bone dry, but it's certainly a difference in texture between when it was wet and when it's ready. You'll know the feel when you touch it. Now whilst the tofu is compressing, we can get on and we can prepare our marinade. We're looking to add 225 millilitres of any cheap white wine. Supermarket own brand stuff is absolutely perfect for this job. And we're going to add it to a medium-sized casserole dish, one just large enough to store all the tofu once it's been cut. We then want to add 1 tablespoon of caper brine to the dish, which is the brine found in a jar of capers. We are then going to add 1 teaspoon of table salt, just sprinkle it about as you add it into the dish. And now we want to add our lemon juice. That can either be 4 tablespoons of lemon juice from a bottle of lemon juice, or we can juice our own lemon. Make sure it's a nice large lemon though. Now when it comes to juicing it, if you do get any pips, make sure you discard all the pips before putting it into the brine, or fish it out the brine if they end up in there. Pulp is absolutely fine, but we don't want pips, because we don't want them to stick to our tofu, then we inadvertently batter them into our tofu, and we end up with horrible pips in our fish. And once the tofu is ready, we want to take and cut it into appropriate bite-sized chunks. So what we want to do is sit it on our end as we see here, then carefully and slowly cut down through the tofu, checking the end of your knife and checking the tip of your knife as you cut down back and forward, just to make sure that those cuts are even throughout the tofu so it doesn't end up out of shape. We then want to take and half it along its length, as we see me doing here, just a nice straight cut down. We then want to turn and cut perpendicular, halving the overall length that we see, and then we're going to half the remaining chunks, which will leave us with 16 equal sized parts, there or thereabouts anyway. And we can now take and add this first block to our marinade. Bare minimum time needs to be 30 minutes marinating, turning halfway through, so 15 minutes in. Flip them around just so the marinade gets all of it. Personally, I though prefer to marinade for the entire day, turning it part way through the day. It just lets me get some prep in the morning and cooking at night. And now we can repeat the same process for our second block. Again, pay particular attention to this very first cut, just so we're checking both the front and the rear of the knife so we get a nice even cut throughout to keep that height the same. Then cut along the length as we do here for 4 blocks, halving it down the long length as we see it again, and then halving each of those sections to again get our 16 roughly equal blocks. And we can now move on and prepare our batter ingredients. So the very first thing we're looking to do is add 225 grams of plain flour to a large mixing bowl. And to the same bowl, we are going to add 50 grams of corn flour. And then 3/4 of a teaspoon of table salt. And lastly, 3/4 of a teaspoon of ground black pepper. As we're going to require it later on anyway, give everything a light mixing together with a whisk, and then set your dry ingredients aside until we're ready to add our ale. Now set up a silicone liner and a wire cooling rack someplace close to where you're going to be cooking. This fits perfectly in the corner of my hob, but you may not want to put it on there, so put it on a worktop very close to where you're going to be cooking. That way we can transfer the cooked fish straight onto it to drain until we need it again. And now in a large, wide, low and heavy pot, similar to what you see here, you're going to add 1.5 litres of cooking oil. It sounds like a lot of oil, but we're going to reserve the oil after we're done cooking and keep it stored in something like a kiln or pot. And now with a nice ale, such as the Belhaven 80 you see here, or any really nice amber ale, we're going to add 320 millilitres to a measuring jug. Now, so you can see exactly how much you've poured and you get an accurate measurement, pour it down the sides rather than into the middle of the measuring jug, and that will stop a heady froth forming if you keep pouring it down the sides. Just tilt it back to level as you get closer to where you think your 320 mils is going to be, just so you get an accurate measure. And once we have an accurate measure, just use a bottle stop to stop the gas escaping from the rest of the ale, because obviously it's a nice ale, so we're going to have the rest of it later. And we're now slowly going to add our ale, whisking and stirring as we go, because what we're looking to do is prevent big lumps in our batter. If we were to just pour it all in a oneer and then try and whisk it, you would end up with huge big lumps that would be really difficult to get out. Adding in small portions or pouring really slowly helps break up the batter as it forms. Yes, you'll end up with a big lump in the centre of your whisk, but that will break down and become smooth as we go compared to just dumping it all in as a oneer. And once the batter is nice and smooth, we're going to add 8 blocks of tofu straight out of the marinade into the batter. Then using a pair of tongs, just take and turn over all the tofu pieces just so we make sure everything's nice and evenly coated. And now we can get our oil up to temperature. We're looking for 180 degrees Celsius. Whilst the oil's getting to temperature, we can also make sure we've got our peas ready to go in the background. And if we're having chips, you can start preheating your oven as well for the chips. But we're going to start the tofu fish first before we put the chips in. So I'm just using a little infrared thermometer here just to confirm that my oil's up to temperature. And once we know it's there, we can start cooking our tofu. And we're going to add our tofu fish pieces into the oil one at a time. Just make sure we do this nice and slowly. We don't want any burns from the oil. Last thing we need is an oil scald. I've had one of them in the past and they're not pleasant things. So slowly and carefully. And before adding our tofu pieces into the oil, we want to remove any excess batter off them, and we do that just by giving a slight couple of dunts off the edge of your bowl with the tongs, and that removes the excess that we don't need. If we fail to take the excess off, we do run the risk of running out of batter, so that's why it is important just to give it that wee sugar against the edge to remove the excess. After all, we want enough batter to double batter every piece. Now visually, we do need to keep a good eye on our tofu fish as it's cooking away. We're looking in general somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes, but visually what we're looking for is the tofu to be sort of golden colour. If that's what it's like, then we bring it out instead of waiting too long and starting to burn it. Now whilst it's cooking away, we take and we add our next set of tofu from the marinade into the batter, turn it over just like before to make sure it's fully coated, and also check that none of the tofu in the oil is sticking to each other or sticking to the bottom of the pan. And once they look ready, as I've already said, between 2 and 3 minutes, when they're nice and golden, we take them out and we're going to sit them on our wire rack. Now if we line them up in rows of 8 whilst they're draining of the oil that's on them, that way we know which row is which for when we go to add more batter to them for the important double battering. But again, just like when we added them, we also want to be careful when we take them out, as we don't want any splashback, we don't want burnt by the oil. And now that our first batch is on the wire rack, we're going to take and add our second batch to the oil and start repeating the process. Again, being careful so as not to burn ourselves. Once all the parts are in the oil, we're going to take another 8 pieces of tofu and add that to the batter, and just like before, we're going to move them all around to make sure they're evenly coated. Skipping ahead to the last batch of our first cycle that's cooking in the oil, we're then going to take our very first batch of tofu and we're going to add that back into the batter. And we want to be really gentle with this stage so we don't destroy any of the batter that we've already cooked onto the tofu. So gently with a pair of tongs, move this around in our batter mix, gently coating and covering everything. And now it's just a case of repeat the cycle until everything has been fully double battered. So this currently is the last of our first cycle, and we remove that from the oil and then repeat one more cycle for everything. And now that our last batch is just about ready to come out the oil, we can start serving up. So I'm going to have these with some mushy peas, some chips, some tartar sauce, and don't forget to add some lemon juice. Add a couple of lemons sitting in the fridge there, ready to squeeze over them just to get some right sharpness to them, and I forgot. So don't forget your lemon. Now, as much as I absolutely adore this meal, I actually prefer it on the second night when we reheat our second batch of the tofu fish. Why? Because the batter is so crispy on the second night when you've oven cooked it. So you're going to oven cook it for 10 minutes at 220 degrees and the batter just crisps up wonderfully. That's not to say it's not gorgeous as it is. It really is, but it just becomes something slightly different again when you do the reheat. Or alternatively, instead of reheating and serving up the second half of this batch the following night, you can actually freeze these tofu slices up really well also. If you're going to freeze them, just cook them the same, 10 minutes, 220, and they are delish. So there we go. Beer battered tofu fish, and it is, before you take a bite, I'm going to tell you this is delicious. It's worthwhile making your own tartar sauce as well, compared to jarred stuff. I hate jarred tartar sauce. It's bleh. I've never liked it, but it's worthwhile making your own tartar sauce as well. And a little bit of that, let's have a wee look. me that that does not look delish, because it is. One of the key things is the double batter. By double battering it, you just get so much more crunch with the nice, soft, almost buttery melting of the tofu. It's gorgeous. Never been a fish fan in my life. A couple of chippies, I really particularly liked the stuff they did. The ones I particularly liked the stuff they did, they definitely double battered. So crack in, make yourself some beer battered tofu fish. Take care, guys. I'm off to have dinner. Bye bye. Oh, as a wee addendum to making this, you get to keep some ale for yourself. Yummy, yummy. Slange.